So, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sky Krikoff, and I am the President of the History Council of South Australia. On behalf of the History Council, I would like to warmly welcome you all today. It's great to have so many of you here. And I'd particularly like to welcome our presenters and our facilitator, Beth Robertson, Philip Jones, Cam Coventry, and Amanda Nettelbeck. And we'd like to thank you in advance and acknowledge the time that you've put into preparing for today and for giving up your Saturday afternoon. So I'd like to start by acknowledging that wherever you are, we are situated on the land on Aboriginal land that was never ceded. And I live in the Adelaide Hills. I'm on Paramount land, but the History Council usually meets in Adelaide on Kaurna land. I'd like to pay my respects to elders of those places, past, present and emerging, and to acknowledge the ongoing connections that Aboriginal people have with the land of their forebears. So History Council is the peak representative body for all things history related in South Australia. We are not government funded, we rely on memberships for funding. As such, we are independent, which makes us in a very well position to advocate for anything history and heritage connected. We are always welcome new members, so if there's anyone out there that is thinking of joining, please have a look at our website, look at the membership page and sign up. We would love to have you on board. Lots of things we do. We organise the annual Historians Awards and the awards night. We administer the Wakefield Press with the State Library and with the Marsden Schwarzbord Foundation. We've launched a new fellowship, History Council South Australian History Fellowship, which is being run through the State Library. And one of the other things we do is organise a regional lecture every year. But this year, because of COVID, we thought it would be safest not to go out to the regions, but to have a webinar. And in light of everything that's happened this week, I'm particularly glad that we did decide to do that. Today's topic is pre- and early-colonial South Australia's slavery connections, which we thought was particularly pertinent this year in light of the Black Lives Matter movement, which has been unfolding across the globe. This is part one of a two-part series. Next year, we're going to look at Aboriginal people's experiences in the colonial era and parallels with slavery. Each speaker has got 20 minutes in total, so 15 minutes to talk and 5 minutes for questions. At the end, there's going to be time for a roundtable discussion and more questions from the audience. And I really hope that everyone engages with the topic and gets a lot out of it. And feel free to ask your questions, which Christy, the Vice President of the History Council, is now just going to quickly run through how you can ask questions and a few housekeeping matters. So thank you very much, Christy.
Thanks, Sky. Hi, everyone. Yeah, just a few housekeeping matters from me. Obviously, you all know where your toilets and emergency exits are. I don't need to tell you where those are, and I don't need to tell you to mute your mobile phones. But what I do need to tell you is, so we've chosen a Zoom meeting format today for the webinar as opposed to delivering this on a webinar platform. We've done that because at the History Council, one of the reasons that we bring people together for these lectures is not only to share research and South Australian history, but also to share a love of history. So we thought it was really important that this had a real a peopled feel to it, that you could see each other and you could get a sense of the community that's here today. So what that means is you can all see each other, and technically you can unmute yourselves and you can comment. We would like to ask you to keep your microphones off, to keep yourselves muted. In the back end here, I can mute you if for whatever reason you accidentally unmute yourself and we can hear your lounge room conversation. But generally, if you could keep yourselves muted, that would be fabulous. We've got a lot of people joining today. There's people still joining right now. We've got over 100 people subscribed today. So we do have a lot of people in the Zoom room here. So if you could just keep yourselves muted, it makes it a lot easier for me to manage the tech in the background. Questions we are going to manage through the chat function. I see a couple of you have already been in the chat function there. If you use that little chat function to post any questions, what we'd also ask is in this first 5 minutes or so, you jump onto the chat and let us know where you're tuning in from. It's always lovely to see where everyone's coming from. We often have regional and interstate and sometimes international guests at these lectures, so it'd be great if you could jump in the chat and tell us where you're from. And then if you have any burning questions during the presentations, put them in the chat. We'll keep an eye on them, and Amanda, who you'll meet in a moment, will also be keeping an eye on those questions. Oh, great, thank you. We've got people already. We've got some, oh great, we've got some people from Victoria. We've even got USA. I'm not even sure what time it is over there, but welcome. That's it for the housekeeping, Sky. Great. I'll hand back to Amanda now.
Thanks, Sky and Christy, and good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on where you're tuning in from. It's great to see so many people participating today. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the Ramengeri people as the traditional owners of the land where I'm sitting today in Counter Bay in South Australia, and pay my respects to the Indigenous custodians of all the lands where we are meeting virtually. Sky's already outlined the process, and Christy, the housekeeping, so I won't delay with the introductions because we're already running slightly over time. That won't affect our speakers' times, but it might make our discussion at the end a little bit briefer. If you find you don't have time to ask the questions that you want to ask for the speaker, don't worry, because we'll be having a group discussion at the end. So without further ado, let me introduce Cam Coventry, our first speaker. Cam is a former parliamentary officer who worked for Senator Nick Xenophon in Canberra, but he's now a doctoral student at Federation University in Ballarat, working on Australian post-war social and economic history. But Cam has also previously published on Victoria and South Australian early connections to British slavery through the reinvestment of slavery compensation monies, drawing on the UCL Legacies of Slave Ownership database. So today he'll be speaking to that research to discuss some of colonial South Australia's foundational figures whose names still are emblazoned or embossed on our state map, and who were directly or indirectly the beneficiaries of slavery. So over to you, Cam.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Just get my screen up. Okay. Sorry, now I've got zooms over my notes. Very good. Okay, so good afternoon. I'm delighted to be presenting to you today from Wadawurrung land and participating in what will be a most interesting conversation. Australia's connection to British slavery is a fascinating topic. There have been a number of people who have discussed the slavery connection, as well as some interesting work dealing with South Australia's colonisation, and in particular, Edward Gibbon Wakefield. I will present to you a short but updated version of an article that was published in the middle of last year. I came to this topic out of personal curiosity. My intention was to reveal the extent of exposure to British slavery and demonstrate that many of these people have names instantly recognisable to present-day Adelaideans and South Australians. I was born in Adelaide and raised in the town of Stirling, which is named after the politician Edward Stirling. The house I grew up in was built on a parcel of land originally acquired in 1854 when Governor Henry Young granted it to friends of Stirling. The Tearsmen of the Wood, those motley groups of of squatters, escaped convicts and bushrangers, had been the first Europeans to use the land sacred to the four nations that intersected at what we now call the Adelaide Hills. My wife, Rebecca Coventry, who is also an historian, is a seventh generation farmer who was born in Angaston and grew up in the Barossa Valley. Her ancestors included Lutherans who had fled Europe, purchased land from George Fife Angas, and cleared it of the Aboriginal people who had lived there. The family knew hardship. Her ancestors experienced poverty, alcoholism, and domestic violence. Their story is a far cry from the earthy, romantic version often at risk of stating the obvious, growing up in South Australia, one is exposed to what Marion Courtley called South Australian exceptionalism. Central to the belief is that SA is unique because of its foundation as a free society. It's a troubling idea. A similar belief exists in the United States, where democracy is spoken of as if it arrived in 1776. But the right to vote for workers, women, and non-white peoples came late and only after considerable effort on their part. And then came the procedural difficulties. South Australia was seen as a promised land where entrepreneurs could be free from interference, even from the Crown. While they didn't get this last wish granted, the province was to be their new birth of freedom, a place where capitalism could thrive, revolution could be avoided, people, especially those in the working class, could work hard, and where morality could be cultivated. But it was a society modelled very much on the past, and in particular the United States, as Matthew Birchall shows. South Australia's connection to slavery forces us to reconsider, again, the broader new birth of freedom narrative. It is a financial connection that arose from complex events. The Imperial Parliament ended the British slave trade in 1807, with the law coming into effect in 1808. While the slave trade was then illegal within the empire, the practice of slavery continued to exist until in the 1830s, a reforming Liberal government intervened to create capitalistic conditions. Part of this new market necessitated the freedom of labour. The capitalists believed that workers needed to move to where work was demanded by the market. British overseas chattel slavery, in which people are legally property, technically came to an end in this decade. The British government spent a staggering sum of money from 1835 to compensate property owners and their powerful lobby, something like 40% of that year's budget. It so happens that the new province of South Australia was created at this time. In 1834, an act of the Imperial Parliament was passed setting certain preconditions. A number of the people who pined for the province of South Australia, the people who journeyed there, and the people who passed through it had benefited from this slavery compensation or from slavery. Their names have been catalogued by the Legacies of British Slave Ownership database in the United Kingdom, which was created by historians of the University College London. They have compiled a vast number of names listed in handwritten records that were kept by the Parliament as people applied to the British government for compensation. Notably, it was not just slaveholders applying, but also family members and financiers. The beneficiaries of slavery connected to South Australia constitute an impressive list. I use the term beneficiary to distinguish a class of persons who benefited from chattel slavery as opposed to those who worked slaves directly. It simply isn't realistic to only consider slaveholders, because these people often had complicated financial relationships with other business people, as well as government, which made slavery possible. First and foremost, we have George Fife Angas and Raikes Curry, the two gentlemen pictured. Angas was a Scottish businessman whose interests included companies in the British West Indies that had slave labour in their supply chains. Curry, who was a banker, and whose family bank, Currys & Co., had ties to West Indian slavery, British West Indian slavery. His financial relationship with Angas began in 1829, and they shared a religious zealotry. Curry, who almost certainly never visited the province, would help establish the high society Anglicans there, as well as the state library. Angas saw himself as Pennsylvania's William Penn. He would famously populate his Barossa Valley with the Lutherans at a premium, which he earned their eternal loathing. Together, Angas, Curry and the Curry family helped raise some £50,000 in property sales, thus assuaging the fears of the Imperial Parliament by providing it commercial viability. There is a suggestion that significantly more money was involved, with Curry potentially providing security for as much as £80,000 in the value of the time. But the evidence points to this being some kind of backup plan if Angas and the South Australian Corporation failed to secure the necessary land sales. This episode shows the close relationship between Curry and almost every one of the proclaimed founders of the province. There are other South Australians who were beneficiaries as well. I won't list them all here, just for the sake of time. So we have South Australia's 9th governor, Anthony Musgrave, who had strong familial ties to slavery. Notably, he was a serial governor who was also governor of Queensland, where he took his considerable knowledge of sugar planting and was instrumental in progressing that colony's agriculture, which notably used Aboriginal slaves. August Sophia Marriott August Sophia Marriott and her brother, the Reverend Charles Marriott Jr., would have benefited substantially from slavery through their father and uncle. August would marry Governor Henry Fox Young, Augusta, I should say, and Charles would be helpful in fulfilling Curry's ambition and establishing Holy Trinity Church on North Terrace. The financier and merchant Jacob Montefiore and his brother Joseph similarly had connection to slavery money through their father. They were influential in the creation of South Australia and instrumental in establishing the Australian Jewish community. The last beneficiary I will mention is Edward Stirling. He was, in the language of the time, an illegitimate child of Archibald Stirling. Archibald was recorded as having received a large sum of compensation in 1835 for over 460 slaves. Edward was gifted £1,000 in 1838 so that he could journey to South Australia to start a life there. Stirling and his sons made an influential family, being involved in the formative years of South Australia. Excuse me. It is worth noting that there are a great many place names that honour these people. Angas and Curry Streets, Montefiore Hill, Stirling, Port Augusta, Angaston, Cape Wiles, and the Musgrave Ranges, to name a few. There is also the brand of imported fruits, Angus Park, which can be found nationwide. So this connection to British slavery is hiding in plain sight. With the Legacies database, historians are coming to terms with South Australia's connections to British slavery. I argue that local communities should resolve to change place names that celebrate beneficiaries of slavery. Obviously, this is only a general rule. There are 4 points to make. Firstly, under the relevant laws and regulations, place names effectively constitute a celebration of a significant person. In most cases, it is up to local authorities in consultation with local communities to decide if they think the names should be changed to reflect present-day values. Place names are not about educating the populace. No one learns history by mindlessly memorizing a street name or walking past a statue. Such things are about celebration of an individual. The law permits us to indulge in a consideration of morality. Secondly, and obviously, chattel slavery was an appalling racist thing. And this was true in its own time. You know, black people were seen as inferior humans, even subhuman, and could therefore be owned by white people. To keep celebrating the names of people who benefited directly from slavery is a symbolic continuation of the original injustice. It is a slap in the face to those people in our society who are not white, as it is to those people who experience modern slavery. Thirdly, and this is a practical element, celebrating individuals is always going to produce this kind of problem because humans are fallible. You know, even someone who used to be upheld as the most perfect person, Mother Teresa, or now Saint Teresa, was found wanting after it was shown that she maintained poverty for those under her care and embezzled charitable funds. Put simply, we set ourselves up to fail. Australia, perhaps more than anywhere else, has a tendency to name everything after individuals. It makes more sense, I think, to celebrate local area, land, harvest, seasons, climate, our aspirational rights, or the names given by Indigenous people. Lastly, we should consider the moral aspect of slavery. It's clear we cannot solely measure people by their intentions because this is fairly well useless. You know, even the most reprehensible of people from history tended to have the betterment of society firmly in mind. It must be remembered that at the time South Australia was colonised, profit was seen as a moral reward for thrift and guile. That is, entrepreneurial talent. So one was morally entitled to sell a good or service for more than it cost to provide. Without this moral understanding, profit is just socially acceptable daylight robbery. We still think of profit in moral terms, but differently. You know, we think of morality, you know, the morality of investing in fossil fuels, the exploitation of children, alcohol, tobacco, discrimination, and animal welfare. So to most of us, profiting from slavery is reprehensible, but the capitalists of the mid-19th century, this wasn't so obvious. One could be profiting or benefiting from slavery at the same time as advocating for its abolition, a similar phenomenon to the one seen in America with people like Thomas Jefferson. Another aspect of this profiting from slavery is that chattel slavery was, the chattel slaves were converted into token money. Compensation acknowledged that the property had been legitimate until it wasn't. That is to say, the Imperial Parliament was buying out slave holders in order to free slaves. It wasn't freeing slaves, issuing apologies and providing them with compensation for false imprisonment. Taking on money was, in a financial sense, taking on the slave, but in a different form, a liquidated asset. Beneficiaries of slavery often became politicians. Their actions tended to have greater consequences than those over which they ruled. These beneficiaries had an impact on the people of the province. For example, the historian Frank Bongiorno describes in Sex Lies of Australians the views of Edward Stirling's son, Edward Jr., who advocated social purity and railed against what he saw as rampant promiscuity in South Australia's youth caused by juvenile immorality. Unsurprisingly, people from the past cast moral judgments and shaped the world around them. When it comes to place names, we shouldn't be afraid to do the same and reflect our present-day values. At the beginning of this year, I was told discreetly that there is a family in Ballarat who live in fear that their wealth will be targeted for reparations payments because of my research. I burst out laughing. They really shouldn't worry. Australia is a very conservative country despite its progressive pretensions. The other challenge to this work is that it is part of cancel culture and attempts to hide history. While I agree that there is a line between debate and suppression that is occasionally crossed by the so-called left wing, it is almost invariably true that the real cancel culture is perpetrated by those who have embraced the term. If you look through Australian history, as well as European and American history, you will find countless examples of people speaking out against injustice and being persecuted in return. I can think of a number of people in our own time who are being persecuted by supposedly democratic governments for revealing uncomfortable information. Let's not forget, we are talking about an empire that had violent money-making schemes that resulted in millions of people being enslaved and killed. That is not akin to the Coon cheese label being retired or the electorate of Batman in Melbourne having its name changed. It's also absurd to argue that this is high. It's quite the opposite, obviously. The historian Catherine Hall argues, forgetting is always an active process. Britons enjoyed congratulating themselves collectively on their magnificent gestures in ending the trade and then slavery, their gift of liberty to others. What got erased was the 2 centuries of intimate involvement in the whole slavery business. So if the British remember the abolition of the slave trade and not slavery, the Americans remember the Civil War and not the tragedy of Reconstruction, and Australians remember the heroism of Anzac, but not the violence from which it came, or, as we've seen recently, has inspired. The connection to British slavery can be seen as yet another reason for white Australia to not be proud of its history. And who wants to feel more guilt when we can fanatically declare ourselves the greatest country on earth, the country where, if you want to go, you gotta go, subject to termination. I don't think guilt is the right response. It's insular and not constructive. Guilt forces history back underground. When the actor Ben Affleck discovered his familial links to slavery because of the Legacies database, he tried to suppress news outlets from reporting the story. What resulted is known as the Streisand effect, where someone's attempt to hide a story creates much more interest than it would have created had it been reported without his intervention. Logically, no one is capable for events that predate their existence. We are responsible for how we remember our history. Good history does not attempt to mask, conceal, or minimize the unflattering connection to British slavery. I want to end with the words of the broadcaster Peter Gers, who made the point in the Adelaide Advertiser that whatever the good deeds performed by the beneficiaries of slavery in South Australia, the key test is whether they improved the lives of the slaves and communities of the British West Indies. In a moral sense, as Gers says, they laundered money in SA. So please feel free to take a photo of this list if you want to read more about South Australia and the links to slavery and capitalism. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Cam. I see that we've actually run through the 20-minute allowance for the first speaker. So what Kirsty and I suggest is that we hold over questions for Cam until the end. Otherwise, we're eating into the time for other speakers. So I think there'll be lots of rich discussion around those issues, particularly relating to debates about place names, which connect, of course, to statue debates everywhere at the moment. It's a global debate. So, yeah, please keep your questions for Cam until the discussion time at the end. I'll now introduce Philip Jones. Philip is Senior Curator of Anthropology at the South Australian Museum, where he's curated a very, very many number of exhibitions on Aboriginal art, material culture, the history of exploration, and many other subjects. He's also, as I'm sure you all know, an award-winning author of history and of the histories of material culture. And amongst his many publications, his book, Ochre and Rust, won the 2008 Prime Minister's Award for Non-Fiction. Philip has just completed a book on George French Angas, the artist, and today he's speaking about George French Angus's father, George Fife Angas, one of South Australia's colonisation commissioners, and of course a key foundational figure of the colony. George Fife Angas was a member of the Anti-Slavery Society. He was an active proponent of legal equality and religious freedoms, but before his interests in South Australia, He also had management of his family's mahogany interests in British Honduras, which of course was an industry dependent upon slavery. So over to you, Philip.
Whoops, I've just unmuted myself. So thanks very much, Amanda, and thanks everyone for listening in to this fascinating topic. Yes, well, I have just completed a book on George Fife Angas, who was the eldest son of George Fife. And what struck me as I was working through that biography was the frame of mind that George Fife Angas brought to his depictions of Aboriginal people in particular. What we see in that period in the early 19th century in Australia is very often caricatures of Aboriginal people or images which are founded on preconceptions of Aboriginal people as the other, as being scarcely human and certainly not civilized. This comes through, it's almost a litmus test, comes through in the art. And in the case of George Fife Angas, we see human individuals in his artwork. And I won't say they're sentimentally painted, because I don't think they were. Angas was primarily a natural history painter, and he was painting what he saw. So how could it be that somebody who was really only 22 coming to South Australia, and therefore you could say a victim or a product of his upbringing, if he was brought up in a slaving family, how was it that he had this enlightened outlook towards Aboriginal people? And I wouldn't want to generalize about that, but it's something that got me thinking. And so I looked into the activities of his father to some degree, excuse me, and I found the fascinating history of George Fife Angas's entanglement with the slavery question in Honduras. So I'm going to relate a chain of events. In the 1780s, Angus's father, Caleb Angas, who was part of the Angas family which had come south from Scotland in the 17th century, Caleb Angas established a mahogany business in Newcastle as an ancillary to his coach building business. The coach building business took off because in the early period of the 19th century, the British roads were improved to such a degree that you could introduce better coaches that would go intercity, if you like, and do this reasonably efficiently. But it could only happen if you had the build right. And mahogany was the timber that could do this. So from the 1780s, the logging concessions in what was still the Spanish territory of Honduras were open to British loggers. Caleb Angas joined in on this. Now, what we're talking about is the first wave, if you like, of global capitalism. And in that first wave, we can see it all over the world. The degree of fervor for making money at a rate which had never been made before by middle-class people who now had access to the means of production. The rate of exploitation of landscapes and of people was extraordinary. It isn't stepping back, I guess. it isn't common to find in that first wave of capitalism people who are motivated by concern for their fellow men. I would say that is probably an understatement. But in the second wave, the second generation, you do see these people emerging. And in Angus's case, Caleb Angas had several sons. Two of them in particular made an impact on his business. William Henry Angas had been a sea captain involved in the Honduran trade. And by 1818, he was considerably older than George Fife Angas, who was the youngest son. He had established himself in the business, but he did so in a particular way. He was a deeply Christian man, and he was one of the dissenters of Newcastle upon Tyne. These dissenters were excluded from public office. They couldn't attend university. They were treated as badly as the Catholics were at that time. And so they made their way in other fields, and mercantilism was one of them. And William Henry joined the family business, but he did so only if he could appoint Christian sea captains. And he was the one who instituted the Bethel system of illuminating the crews with Christian services when they arrived in port. This was his contribution, I suppose, in terms of humanity and ameliorating the lot of people who were being invaded by mercantilism, particularly in the West Indies. You could say it was a small effort, but it was nevertheless effective. So when George Fife joined the business, he joined the business in 1818 after having previously been working for it, but he joined as a partner. And immediately he did so. He related to his colleagues and to those around him that he would make a difference for the Indians of Honduras. Now, it's easy to look back on this and say, oh yes, well that's a sop to liberal thinking. However, he did it in a very business-like way, and he realized that in Honduras, the system that perpetuated slavery and had introduced it was run by essentially a town council. Honduras didn't have a government as such. And so the representatives from that first wave of capitalism held sway. And they were the ones who had the slaves, and they were the ones who appointed the magistrates. So everything George Fife tried to do in terms of relieving the position of the slaves was stymied by this political system. It turns out, though, that he had a major ally in Honduras, and this will surprise a lot of people, well, I think, when you hear his name, because he was Colonel George Arthur, who later went on to become the governor of Tasmania and the instigator of the infamous Black Line. So we're already finding that as a prominent British jurist put it, all great men are bad. There are no exceptions, or every individual involved in this business had a downside. George Arthur found himself historically in a particularly tricky position when he arrived in Tasmania. But in Honduras, he was seen as an enemy of the capitalist class. He wanted to outlaw slavery, and he did everything he could. In 1823, working with George Fife Angas, he introduced a bill or an order, an edict really, in British Honduras, outlawing the slavery of Indians, not the slavery of the African slaves, because he had a particular reason for looking at the Indians. And this was something that George Fife got onto and pursued after Colonel Arthur was recalled to England in 1822. George Fife realised that there had been an edict presented by the governor of Jamaica back in 1776, indicating that the Indians of British Honduras, they were the original owners of the soil, to put it that way, and they could not be legally enslaved. So you could say, well, this is an easy thing. You just simply bring this before the authorities and slavery will be expunged for the Indians. Now, this isn't what happened. It took a concerted campaign, and Wilberforce was involved in the Anti-Slavery Society. Fowl Buxton, whose name is perpetuated in Buxton Street, North Adelaide, for example. And a number of others came to Angus's aid. He had to be extremely careful and to remain anonymous because his name was already dirt in British Honduras for the stance that he'd taken against slavery. So in 1824, finally, through the offices of the Earl of Bathurst, who was otherwise known as something of a reactionary, he supported this because there were gruesome accounts of the way that the Indians, the Honduran Indians, were being treated. What I don't know, and I think there'll be fertile ground in the UK archives to investigate this, is the extent to which George Fife Angas was compromised not only by his ownership or his inheritance of ownership of the Indian slaves, but also of the African slaves. And it appears that Angas realised that freeing the African slaves was simply a bridge too far, partly because British Honduras was under Jamaica, and as we know, the links between British establishment and the Jamaican slave trade were deep and almost inextricable. So really, even though Wilberforce was involved in Angus's initiative to free the Indian slaves, Wilberforce could do nothing about the larger question until the steam had built up over the next few years for the eventual passing of the Reform Act and the Act to abolish slavery in Britain. And as Cam mentioned, slavery had actually been outlawed, or slave trading had been outlawed by the British government in 1808, but nothing had been done about it on a practical level. So, so there we are. We have somebody, George Fife, who inherited this situation. He, as the second wave, the second generation, attempted to do something about it. And he did so because he was, if you read his diary and his letters, on almost every page of his diary, Angus is pouring out his heart on some matter of principle, morality, or ethics. For the time, he was an extraordinary capitalist in that he was an indicator of what could happen if capitalism was put in the hands of people who had a conscience and a set of ethics. And I think what we have to do now is zoom in on these people, look at all the archive that is relevant to them, measure their actions against their rhetoric, and look into the motivations and the opportunities that they had at that moment. And when we do that, we find that the struggle to overturn slavery, which had become entrenched in that first generation was a mammoth struggle. It was not something that could simply be, oh, let's form a committee and put a recommendation forward, because there were entrenched slave owners and traders who were operating the British parliamentary system. And I think, I don't know how I'm going for time, but I think maybe I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Philip. In fact, your timing was perfect. I was about to jump in. And yeah, thank you. I think you really kind of brought out those ways in which there are such deep ties and global connections between the slavery debates at the time and the foundations of the Australian settler colonies and South Australia in particular. Well, Christy and I are aware that we were already running over when we began, and we've sort of accrued a little bit more of running over. So we've decided that we'll just hold all questions to the end so that we can maximise the discussion as a group, and we'll move straight on with our third speaker, who is already in the Zoom room, Beth Robertson. Beth is Manager of Preservation Services at the State Library of South Australia, and for many years she was the library's Oral History Officer and is author of Australia's Oral History Handbook, now in its 5th edition, and a book that many of us have used extensively. Beth's done an enormous amount of research on South Australia's history and biographical histories, including most recently on South Australia's historical links to the global slavery system. And today she's talking about her research on Edward Stirling, one of South Australia's most prominent early colonists, as we've already heard, who partly owed his success to the profits of slavery, but as Beth is going to tell us, his story was also much more complex. Thank you, Beth.
Thank you. Now, right, can you all see my slide? Thank you, and I'm very pleased to be speaking today from Blackwood, Ghana land. Edward Stirling is my great-great-grandfather. Family oral tradition held that he was born in Jamaica to a black mother and a Scottish plantation owner, that his father took him to Scotland to be educated, funded him to come to South Australia, and bailed him out when an initial pastoralist venture failed. Correspondence between Edward and his father that has come to light tells a more nuanced and compelling story. There is no doubt that Edward Stirling was a descendant of slavery. He remained silent about the place of his birth, allowing contemporaries and later chroniclers to refer to him as Scottish without being able to be specific. Oops, there we go. He was born about 1808 on Hampden Estate, a Jamaican sugar plantation and rum distillery. His Scottish father, Archibald Stirling, had managed family plantations in Jamaica since 1789, the year that William Wilberforce first addressed British Parliament about the abolition of slavery. Archibald did not marry in Jamaica, a colony in which white men of all ranks indulged their sexual license without censure. He fathered at least 6 illegitimate children there. Edward, 2 other reputed sons and 3 reputed daughters are named in his will, as well as the mother of 2 of the daughters. Of the range of possible unions between white men and enslaved and free women of African and mixed descent, planters typically kept free women of colour. These housekeepers, as they were euphemistically known, were expected to perform all the duties of a wife, except that of presiding at table. Descendants' DNA results currently indicate that Edward's mother was the daughter of a Ghanaian woman. Edward's white heritage would have made him unsuitable for field labour. He probably spent his early childhood working at Hampton's Great House as a waiting or houseboy. In 1815, his father returned to Scotland, aged 46, and made an advantageous marriage to 22-year-old Elizabeth Maxwell. She gave birth to Archibald's legitimate heir in 1818. Archibald did not entirely abandon his illegitimate children. He sent 2 of his sons and 2 of his deceased brother's illegitimate sons to Scotland to be educated, but not into his family home at Stirling. The 4 boys, including Edward, aged about 8, were installed at the parochial school in St Vigin's near Arbroath. They lived with the schoolmaster John Bowman. An exercise book in Edward's hand shows that he was educated to be a clerk or small business owner, indeed the kind of education required of a plantation bookkeeper. The brother who remained in Jamaica became a carpenter on the Hampton estate. When Edward finished school in his teens, he was employed by associates of his father, the Denniston brothers of Glasgow. Among their business interests, they imported sugar from the West Indies and owned hundreds of slaves in Trinidad. Edward could have remained in this position, employed but unmarried, excluded from the society of his father and separated from the society of his birth. But at about 30 years of age, his life took another dramatic turn. Between November 1835 and October 1838, Archibald Stirling received a total of £11,000 in the government compensation for his share of 690 Jamaican slaves. It appears that Archibald, who had been widowed since 1822, chose this time to advise Edward that he was to have an inheritance. A co-signed note survives. Glasgow, 6th of November 1838. Dear Sir, writes Edward, as you had intended to leave me at your death, as you told me, £1,000, but in consequence of my having a wish to proceed to Australia, you now agree to give the above sum which I have this day received. Archibald signs under the phrase, receipt in full of all demands, and Edward and his cousin Charles, illegitimate and Jamaican born, sailed on board the Lady Bute for Adelaide on the 29th of January 1839. Thanks to Edward's accelerated inheritance, he and Charles were able to establish themselves immediately in South Australia. They were 2 of the 10 proprietors who paid for the Angas Special Survey on the well-resourced lands of the Peramunk people at what became Strathalbyn. By early 1845, the cousins owned 4 Strathalbyn sections and were also grazing their flocks over adjacent so-called unoccupied land. Edward had named the property Hampton after the place of his birth and become engaged to Harriet Taylor, the sister of another nascent pastoralist. In mid-1845, the Stirlings joined with neighbouring sheep farmers and the South Australian Company in taking up occupation licences at Riverley Bay for their burgeoning flocks. The cousins moved nearly 3,000 sheep southeast at a cost of over £500. Within a few months, 2/3 of the flock had died of a grievous scourge. It later became known as coast disease, identified in the 1930s as a deficiency of cobalt and copper. The cousins were in debt and their earning capacity was severely depleted. By this time, Archibald Stirling was the laird of the Stirlings of Keir family estate and living in Keir House outside Stirling. Since emigrating, Edward and Charles had apparently written letters to Archibald to keep him informed of their progress, but received no replies. Edward now wrote 2 desperate letters explaining the financial crisis, the prospect of having to sell their land, his fear of being unable to marry, and of being in breach of promise. But he also informed Archibald that Adelaide merchant Robert McGeorge was covering their debts in return for a bill of exchange for £600, which had been sent to Archibald's banker, Campbell and Co. of Glasgow, for payment. In June 1846, Archibald replied in fury, "You had no right to ask for more money, no right to involve third parties, and no right to have contemplated marriage." But Edward's strategy worked, and Archibald honoured the bill. Archibald died in April the following year, 4 months before Edward, aged about 39, and Harriet, 26, married in August 1847. Their first child, Edward Charles, was born at Hampton in September 1848. Edward went on to enlarge his pastoralist holdings, be nominated to the Legislative Council that wrote the South Australian Constitution, and, as a partner in Edward Stirling and Co., make his fortune financing the Wallaroo and Moonta mines. He moved his family to England in 1864 so that his oldest son, known as Ted, could begin university at Trinity College, Cambridge. Ted and 2 of his 7 siblings, Lance and Anne, returned to South Australia. Ted named his Adelaide Hills home St Vigin's after his father's school and displayed Edward's portrait in the dining room. It is an anglicised rendering of a photograph which disguises Edward's features. However, Ted also adopted a negroid head on his bookplate. For many years, I assumed that this was an extraordinary acknowledgement of his slave forebears, but it is a variation of crests used by branches of the Stirling family that predated their involvement in Jamaica by about 100 years. I believe that Ted used the crest and the motto, gang or go forward, to identify with his Scottish forebears and that he was troubled by his African heritage. I expect that both he and his father feared being labelled with racial classifications. There is certainly complexity in Ted's racial attitudes. When he was asked to give evidence at the 1913 Royal Commission on the Aborigines, he was both Professor of Physiology at the Adelaide University and Director of the South Australian Museum, undertaking expeditions to Central Australia. After being questioned about Aboriginal housing, diseases, hospital facilities, and the future of the race, he was asked whether there was anything else he would like to raise. He replied, "I would like to refer to the half-caste children. My opinion is that the more of those half-caste children you can get away from their parents and place under the care of the state, the better. I am aware that you are depriving the mothers of their children, and the mothers are very fond of their children, but I think it must be the rising generation who have to be considered." No doubt Ted believed that his father was proof of this approach, but the very fact that even with all his accomplishments, Ted could not cite his own racial heritage in support of his argument gives lie to that. These are the opening pages of the article being published this month about Edward and another slave descendant, John Harvey, in the Historical Society of South Australia newsletter. Since I've begun talking and writing about Edward and Ted's racial background, I have been hearing about how it features in others' oral traditions. One example will suffice for today. Recently, a male historian of my generation told me that the former South Australian Governor, Sir Walter Crocker, who lived to be 100 in 2002, had told him about the Stirling's racial history. Crocker is described in an obituary as an urbane Anglo-Australian who took to English culture and style as to the manner born. He gloried in the 1920s and 30s, when it still seemed that the sun would never set on the British Empire and that era's ordered lifestyle. Crocker's education of my colleague in the late 20th century is an echo of the ways in which 19th century contemporaries reminded themselves that Edward was not really one of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Beth. That's terrific, and a reminder of those complex links between the benefits from the slavery system and the descent lines from slavery. We are now inviting questions into the Zoom chat box, and we have a bit less than half an hour. So while I am waiting for your questions to appear, I might just lead off with a question for the panel to give you time to think of some questions. It is interesting that since the availability of the Legacies of Slave Ownership database, historians more broadly have been drawing out all these complex ways of the kind that you've been speaking about, that free migration to the Australian colonies from the 1830s was part of a much broader imperial process of building a supposedly more liberal empire after the abolition of slavery. But this process of building a more kind of liberal rule also, of course, funneled financial capital directly from slavery into settler colonialism. Obviously, this wasn't unique to South Australia in any way, but the timing of South Australia's foundation in the mid-1830s might make us sort of think more closely about these global lines of connectivity between the ends of slavery and the escalation of Aboriginal dispossession. So perhaps I could just lead off by asking the panelists to elaborate on how these kinds of connections might invite us to reorient our thinking about the nature of settler colonial foundations.
I'll start. Sorry, can you hear me? Or?
Yes.
Oh, good.
We can hear you, Cam.
Brilliant. Yeah, so I mean, it's absolutely fascinating with South Australia because of the coincidence of events. You know, I mean, you know, what I didn't say in the presentation was that money was coming in the same way to other states in Australia as well. So there's nothing particularly unique about South Australia, say compared to Victoria, which is the only other state that I've looked at. But yeah, the fact that it occurred, you know, at exactly the same point is quite interesting. And I think with you know, if you look at the land sales instrument that was, you know, necessary or deemed necessary in order to go ahead with South Australia's creation, South Australia having failed to be created on another occasion, you know, I think that there's a direct connection there. I mean, South Australia, you could say that at least at that point owes its existence to Angas and Curry's and Co. Bank. You know, does that mean that they owe their existence to slavery? Certainly, partly. Yeah. So I think it has greater implications for South Australia than it does for, say, Victoria in that regard. I'm not sure if Philip, did you have come across much between Curry's and Co. and Angas? And he had a bank too, I think. Angas had a bank as well.
Philip, you're on mute.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. And in a way, this move in that second wave of capitalism to banking and deals and accommodation with with others, a network, suited Angas so well, because he was, when you read his correspondence and his journals, he was an amazing networker. And his battle, successful ultimately to free the Indian slaves of British Honduras, who probably amounted to 200 to 300. I mean, that's to put it in perspective. It wasn't thousands and thousands. The British settlement of Honduras was relatively small. But what Angas did do was send a message to others in his network that there were other ways of being a capitalist. Now, whether his link with Curry it isn't clear to me. Curry is certainly not a major correspondent of Angus's. He doesn't mention him much in his journal. Clearly, they had common interests, but I'm familiar with the claim that Angas, that Curry may have put in or had in reserve an enormous amount of money, which sort of tipped the balance possibly in favour of the South Australian venture going ahead as a province rather than an actual British colony. But it isn't clear that the two of them actually held similar views on anything in particular, including slavery. So obviously there's a lot more to find out about Curry than I think there is about Angas, because Angas is so transparent in his journals and his correspondence. He takes up causes and he doesn't let them rest until he succeeds. What still troubles me about Angas is whether he knew about slavery involving the African slaves but did nothing about it. To me, that's unclear, and we really don't know the answer to that yet.
Thank you, Philip. There are some questions coming in now, and just in response to Margaret Ford's query, Claire Smith has provided the link to the database, which is the Legacies of Slave Ownership database hosted by the University College London, built out of a big project between Catherine Hall and team there. Jane Lydon has asked a couple of questions. One to you, Beth, about Edward Stirling, about whether he understood his father's heritage or whether he was simply unable to name it. And related to that, Christy has asked whether you know how his family was received when Edward Sr. took his family back to Britain. So whether any descendants of the Stirling family have connected with the legitimate descendants of Archibald. And then just before you answer that, I'll also add the question for the whole panelists from Jane on whether any of the speakers would like to speak to a larger question around the tension between biography and the individual complicity of these figures and broader forces at work around the empire, around governance, such as protection. So I think she's asking how these sort of individuals sat within a much more globalized system of governance that was shifting at this time in ways that were meant to be more liberal and humanitarian, but also in a way more intertied with each other's ethical dilemmas. Okay, sorry, Beth first then, I think.
Okay, well, the two questions, firstly was Ted, Edward Stirling's son, aware of his background? Yes, very much so. This knowledge has been handed down in the family from that time and become a matter in which one would learn in one's childhood of this racial background. Now, I think it needs to be said, and there's a lot more to explore around the what Edward Stirling would have internalised from his time in Jamaica. There were, of course, ways in which the white slave owners, very much a minority of the population, divided and conquered the large black population in Jamaica. And one of the ways was to establish another kind of hierarchy of colour, hierarchy of racism, which was based on how many generations distant from the original African slave who arrived on Jamaica's shores. So it's, of course, not a simple thing to suggest that because Edward Stirling Sr. Had considerable Negro blood in him, that he would have felt any common cause with Aboriginal people that he encountered in South Australia. He would have very much been of his time and of his upbringing that would have seen them as removed and more primitive than he would have been brought up to consider himself, even if he hadn't had his white paternal heritage in Jamaica, being those generations removed from Africa. And the other question was whether the two sides of the family that connected when Edward took his family to Africa.
Sorry to cut across you, but there is something wrong with your mic. Could you just check that you don't have paper over your mic or that there's an interruption on your mic?
It's all clear. Might just be that. Are you hearing me now?
We can hear you. It comes and goes with static. So yeah, maybe when you finish speaking, you could try turning your mic on and off, but we can hear you at the moment.
Rightio, I've turned myself on. And yes, when Edward Stirling took his family to England, he made several visits to Scotland. He caught up with local children in Arbroath and St Vigins that he'd been schoolmates with, because they were just members of the local parish. And he also attempted to make contact with his half-brother, Archibald's heir, but family oral tradition is that he was given the cold shoulder, even though at that stage he was so wealthy he may have been able to buy out his half-brother.
Thank you, Beth. Did anybody want to address Jane's question? Could the speakers address the question of the tension between biography and individual complicity and broader forces at work?
Sure. It's not something that I can comment too much on. But I came across a biography, a sort of family biography of the Currys last night, which was published in 2018 by a major someone or other in the UK, and it focuses very much on Minley Manor, which is their residence that Raikes Curry created, which is still there. And it's not surprising to see that there's no mentions of slavery and the connection. And to Philip's point before, that the Currys are there's very little on them, quite sort of mercurial sort of types. But as far as the broader forces are concerned, I think it's worth noting that the nature of capitalism and the fact that Adam Smith, the philosopher and economist behind capitalism, was concerned with morality. He was concerned with the well-being of people. you know, and so this is why I think you get this sort of tension, you know, between individuals who by the 1820s, you know, slaveholders are, you know, thinking about amelioration. They see that as the way to solve the problem is that you treat slaves well and so on and so forth. You know, and it's always been true that I think some slaves, you know, were treated better than others. You know, the sort of brutal slaveholder seems to be a minority. You know, and it's led people like Noam Chomsky to argue that you know, slaves were kept in better condition than neoliberal workers in America are now. There was an interest, an economic interest, to keep workers healthy, whereas under neoliberalism, you know, adequate and affordable healthcare are not exactly, you know, available. You know, but this tension is how I think we see it. This tension between morality and you know, money making. But back then, it wasn't a tension. I mean, you know, there wasn't a tension between Christianity and capitalism to the extent, you know, that we see it. You know, it was all sort of tied up, you know, together. But yeah, I mean, it's of the few biographies that that I've looked at, you know, it's not a preoccupation, and so I think, you know, Beth's work and Philip's tackling this, you know, specifically is really exciting.
Yeah, thanks, Cam. And yes, I'd add to that by saying that I think that, yes, the kind of moral codes of today don't hold in quite the same way, although it would be fair to say that there were, you know, very rich kind of moral anxieties around these questions that then got sheeted home into other sorts of policies. So, as you say, Cam, amelioration and protection of the vulnerable subjects of empire like slaves and Aboriginal people became part and parcel of a system of governance that was supposed to be more ethical, but swept many of the problems just under the counter. But we do have a question from Alice to everyone, but I think probably perhaps for Philip. Was the argument for in British Honduras about people not being enslaved there something that Angus considered in any reflections on Aboriginal dispossession in South Australia?
Just unmute myself. It is a very interesting question. To what extent did Angus carry this baggage with him to South Australia? And I think you can say that that he did to a degree, certainly, because Angus was the one who, without whom, I think it's fair to say, the Germans would not have come to South Australia. And he saw the lot of the Germans, I think, on a spectrum on which the Indians of British Honduras also existed. He could see that wrong was being done to people. This is at a very simplistic level all over the world, and that if he was in proximity to that wrong, he had an obligation to do something about it. In the case of British Honduras, he actually could. He pulled it off. When Auguste Carvel, who was actually working as a street missionary in London in the late 1830s and stayed with the Anguses, George Fife, when Carvel came to him and said that there was persecution of the old Lutherans in Germany going on, Angus dovetailed that with his plans for South Australia, and before long the Germans were in the Barossa Valley. So he had a degree of power over events which is almost unimaginable today in terms of working through and against and around the British official policy. Similarly, among those Germans, well, he also paid for the passage of the missionaries to South Australia. And whatever press the missionaries might have in Australia or all over the world, you can't argue with the fact that these were almost penniless Germans who were making the journey from their homeland to an unknown land with one thing in mind, and that was to bring the word of God to the benighted Aborigines. We see it all differently now, but at that time, this was a humanitarian act. And ultimately, we owe the resurgence in Ghana identity and language to these Germans, and therefore to George Fife Angas. So, you know, if we're drawing lines of responsibility through history to the present day, we have to draw all the lines. And that includes the good and the bad. I don't see that Angas as a slave beneficiary, and we still don't know what he actually how much benefit he received. I don't know that we can see that line manifest itself in any hard decisions he made in South Australia. But this is, you know, we haven't been used as historians to drawing lines as long as that. And now we have to. We're obliged to do that. And that means doing new research, going back into old documents, holding them up to the light and looking at them in a different way. And, you know, it's enjoyable and stimulating and sometimes confronting.
Yes, thank you, Philip. We're running short of time, but I'd like Karen's questions quite a lot earlier on the list. So this is a question for you, Beth, whether you could perhaps just briefly speak about Ted's brother, Sir Lancelot, and his position in the South Australian colony in relation to his background as a lawmaker to Aboriginal people in the colony.
Yes, I'm afraid I'm not prepared with all the information at hand to answer that today. He was a lead of the Legislative Council for decades, became known as the father of the Legislative Council, but that's an area that I'm very much looking forward to inquiring into further. I saw that there was a question about the use of DNA in my family, and yes, we've two generations, my generation and a surviving member of an earlier generation have used the Ancestry DNA system, and I know DNA doesn't pass from one generation to another equally, but about 2% in my generation and about 4% in my father's generation are showing as West African.
Thank you, Beth. I'll just draw people's attention to Kathy's comment that in 1920, Bassadao abducted her grandmother from Central Australia and she was enslaved in the family home until 1957. Her children stolen from her and their children, Kathy included, taken from them. So a statement regarding slavery in First Nations and the consequences today that still affect many Indigenous families. And I think it's a important reminder of the direct links between, again, the ends of slavery and the beginnings of settler colonialism and the escalation of Aboriginal dispossession in this country. I have been asked to finish on time and we are almost out of time, but perhaps just quickly, if one of you might be interested to respond to Nikita's question of whether any of the panelists could comment on the ways in which they navigate the swept under the rug language often used to describe connections to slavery.
I suppose in an unusual position in that it is both, I'm looking at my family background as both the enslaved and the slave owner. And yes, the nature of slavery was certainly not a topic of discussion in our family knowledge of this background. It was much more just a knowledge of the heritage, but not a discussion of the meaning of that heritage.
And I just say that there's a lot that's been swept under the rug, and I look forward to having a look under that rug.
Thank you, Philip. And in terms of lifting the rug, Jane Lydon has also provided here a link to a recent article published by Alan Lester in the History Workshop Journal, which is part of a series of papers on this very subject, and Christy's going to provide that link with the bibliography afterwards. So on that note, we have just hit the 3:30 mark. Thank you so much, everybody, for your rich discussion, and particularly to the three speakers. But in order to say goodbyes, I will pass back to Christy.
Great, thank you, Amanda. That was fascinating, and lots of busy chat behind the scenes, which was fabulous. Thank you. I might actually get Sky to say a couple of good thank yous as well. I'll just remind everyone that this is being recorded. We will make this available probably within the week, so keep an eye out on the History Council's website and socials for notification of the recording. There are a few of you in the background who had some technical difficulties, so the full recording and full audio will be available for you. Sky, would you like to say a few words?
Yep. I'd just like to thank everybody for your questions, and I'd really like to thank each of the three presenters for your fantastic papers. I think that you've given everyone a lot of food for thought, and bringing out those nuances and complexities is just, you know, what history, good history, is all about. So thank you all very much for that. And Amanda, thank you so much for being the facilitator today. That was great. You did a wonderful job, and thank you for, you know, everyone for putting up with any problems with the sound or whatever a couple of times. But that was a great session. On behalf of the History Council, we hope you enjoyed it, and would like to encourage you to keep your eye on our website for any future events that you might want to join as well. Okay, so thanks to all. And Christy, thank you for being managing it all and the technical stuff. Well done. Okay. Thank you all.